Really what I intend to do in this video is just kind of discuss my methods and why I'm fascinated just as a person in the study of history, archaeology, and anthropology. I think it goes down to that single deepest fundamental question that most of all of us have. Why are we here? Where did we come from? The thing that digs deepest with that question is we just can't remember. We can't remember where we started from, where we came from. So stories and gods and creators and devils and demons and angels and jinn, we have serpents and feathered gods and dragons. We have stories that try to answer this. These stories, though, anthropologically, have commonalities. Stories like the flood, the great flood, great cataclysm. This story is in every major belief system. From the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Hopi, from the Christian, from Judaism, from Islamic religions, from Hindu religions. A great cataclysm, a great flood happened. Another commonality is shown in almost every major belief system. Stories of giants, often cannibals, often feared. The Christian Bible, the Nephilim, the Raphaelim, also found in the Torah, found in the book of Enoch. In the Hopi stories, the Aztec stories, in the Algonquin stories, in the Iroquois stories, stories of the rock monsters, the giant flying heads, stories of the cannibals or the chinless ones in the hills. These stories were told as real stories. What if they were? It's not as fantastic as it might sound. But let me first start with the simple single invention that changed all of humanity as we know it. It changed us from a hunter and gathering group species into a sedentary agricultural species. This invention was the plow. The plow and the ability to master agriculture and farming. And what this led to was the creation of something we call a surplus. Once you have a lot of food and you expand your fields and you make more food, you now need more labor or more people, so you have more children. You can now settle because you don't have to chase your food around. You can now take these wild animals and start to domesticate them because you have a surplus of food to feed them. You can then turn a wild horse, you can tame it. You can turn it in to machinery, essentially, to pull your plow. You can stay through winters because you can build shelters. You have to clear forests to create more fields to plant. So a change in technology had to occur because we started planting before we discovered metals. We were still using stone as our material to do everything with, essentially wood and stone to plow the fields and to cut all the trees down. And this Neolithic man quickly found that their fractured hand axes and although very sharp, were brittle and created a lot of friction, not an efficient tool to cut a tree down. So what happened is you saw this change. And this is like the time right around Stonehenge, right when we shifted to hunter-gatherers to agriculture. And we were creating these amazing works, earthworks, ditches, henges. These were used to extremely accurately tell time, solar cycles, lunar cycles. They were used to tell you when to put your plow in the ground, when to sow your seeds, and when to harvest your food. This was essential for the well-being of your society and your civilization in your life. So the single invention that built civilization was the plow, was agriculture. Now, this in itself is what led to civilization. But there's a much older story. I believe our remembered history just stops at some point and we have this great mass amnesia as humanity. It's humanity's amnesia. We forget where we came from. We forget our story because so suddenly the world was annihilated. And the new evidence of the ice core drillings in Antarctica lend absolute credence to a sudden temperature change, which led to the era of time known as the Younger Dryas, about 15,000 years ago, when there's a great temperature shift and all humanity there's no evidence of life in this time period, really. And then towards the later stages of Younger Dryas, we start finding the oldest points that apparently were ever discovered in North America, known as the Clovis points. 15,000 years ago, they're called Clovis. They're discovered in Clovis, New Mexico, and they're found all over the country, and it led to coined the term Clovis culture. And up until about 5-6 years ago, this was the set and argued tagline. There was never any people on this continent before 15,000 years ago. That was the oldest. Well, we know that there's discoveries all over in Canada, down in even New Mexico, I believe, Colorado recently during a excavation for a new highway. Mammoth remains fossilized were found with human tools still embedded in them, butchering site. Clear evidence that this mammoth was killed and butchered by a group of hunter and gatherers probably around 50,000 years ago. So there were plenty of people on this continent way before 15,000 years. So if that accepted tagline was a lie told to us all this time, and we have to look at this comet that came down around 15,000 years ago and struck above Oregon somewhere in slab lands now, and just melted the entire ice sheets, the northern ice sheets that were thousands and thousands of miles thick, instantly, flooding the entire United States. Deluge of floodwaters, like an inland freshwater tsunami, just covering the country, in 2,000 feet of water. It destroyed everything so suddenly and perfectly that hardly any traces are left. But with sites like Göbekli Tepe, recently discovered, and this site was purposely buried and entombed carefully in sand so it was protected. This group knew something awful was coming, and they wanted to leave a very important message to say, don't forget who we were. and how old we are. And this is where the story of the Nephilim, the giants, the Raphaelim, this is where the story comes in. What if cousins like the Denisovan were these giants that are found and then covered up? They are found all over. There's a ton of documentation, archival articles. There's tons of discoveries of giants across the whole world, but especially in North America. There's a ton in the Tennessee Valley along the Mississippi River buried in mounds. The Susquehannock were gigantic people, 6.5 to 8.5 feet by all descriptors. And these remains, these bones were way denser. The teeth were usually perfect, immaculate, or double-rowed. And it was theorized lived much longer. So maybe this group thrived, and there was an advanced civilization of a cousin of ours that ruled all over the world, and this cataclysm wiped the majority of them out. Not all of them. Some of them built great mountaintop shelters, like they're finding in Siberia. Great walls to protect from the floods on the highest of points that they could get to. And groups of them lived. And so did groups of us. A cousin to this bigger, better us, maybe. A lot of legends say they preyed on us. Some of them were very intelligent and could talk with their minds, move things with their minds. These are in English folklore, ancient stories. And they even had names for them. And they were spoken of as real. All the native tribes have stories of cannibals, giant cannibals in the hills, the pale-faced cannibals, the chinless ones, the flatheads, the rock monsters. These are all native legends. The Iroquois had tons of stories of giants in the hills. The Susquehannock in my area said the flatheads, the chinless ones, are in the hills. Be careful of your children and women. They will take them and they will eat them. We do not wander in the hills. So are these stories real, or were they once real? Was it something they remembered from their distant past and they passed the story down in folklore? Or was it a boogeyman story to keep people away from possible silver mines? Who knows? But the mining activity that I found in the sites that I've explored along the Pennypack, they're ancient. This shows signs of mining activity 20, 30,000 years ago and then suddenly stopping for a period. And then more recent time when the Susquehanna moved in, more mining on top of older mines that they probably discovered. So that leaves me to believe there was a whole other culture here before then. Then something stopped all life and then life started again thousands of years later. When you're dealing with that much time, a lot of things can happen. I believe that remnants of these giant versions of us help pass down knowledge and building techniques that we still don't know how to create pyramids. We don't know how to build megalithic and octagonal stone masonry laid with no mortar, moving stones that weigh hundreds of tons that modern cranes cannot move to altitudes that are unimaginable. These building feats and this building style, it was around the world. Everyone was building in the megalithic style, so that means there was a diffusion of ideas, a commonality. It was these, as Genesis calls them, in those days there were still great men, or the great ones, the fallen ones, the Nephilim. And this story comes from the Torah, and then is in the Old Testament, but Judaism borrowed the story from the prior religion of the lands that they settled on, which were the Sumerians. And oddly enough, Göbekli Tepe was found right in the land described in our Bible, in the Christian Bible, as Eden. I'm not Christian, I don't want to cite our, but the Christian Bible, the Torah, and the Sumerian creation stories, they came from the Sumerian creation stories. And another breakthrough, probably about 15 years ago now, 10 to 15 years ago when they found advanced satellite imagery and they actually found a dried up river in between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they found the land between Kent and Cush. They found the land of Eden. It's a real place. And oddly enough, it's where Göbekli Tepe is, right in that general area. A site that was visited for thousands of years. And oddly enough, the architecture, the carvings of the older stuff at this site was far more advanced and more well done than the newer. Doesn't make a lot of sense. We did something better back further that we couldn't do as well as we got newer. It should be the other way around. It's almost like we declined. And I believe that the site was covered in sand. The disaster happened, the floods receded, and later people that remembered the place, this great meeting place of cultures, came back, uncovered it and started digging again, and then something else happened where they filled it back in. So these are just theories tied together with a lot of hard science, and they're not my ideas. This is a idea I support, and I'm just transferring some of the general information about this theory forward, and it needs to be taken seriously for our present well-being. The greatest threat to us as a people right now that could instantly wipe out the entire world is an impact event. It's an asteroid or a meteor or a comet, the worst thing that could hit you. You destroy we'll be back in the Stone Age in a snap of a finger, or worse, completely wiped out. But this is why I believe the big pushback about the impact theory, which is proven not only by these Arctic ice core samples showing this enormous temperature change in the climate of Earth. Not only that, they find these platinum and carbon diamond striations all over the world in the same layer. And these can only be made by a meteoritic impact. So in the same layer all over the world, the same thing, that these same diamond structures can only be created by a massive impact. The only other time they've been created is when we tested nuclear bombs and it turns the sand into glass. This is the same idea. It's found in the same layer across the whole world. So there's so much evidence showing that this sudden impact 15,000 years ago really happened. And I believe the reason a lot of people push back is because it's scary. It's scary to think that not too long ago, 15,000 years ago in geological terms, is less than a blink of the eye. When you're considering that the Earth is 4.3 billion years old, then 15,000 years ago is, in our minds, too scary to imagine the world ending only that short of a time ago. But it teaches us this lesson, that this can happen, and this is a great threat. And right now we have the technology collectively as humans, if applied and collaborated worldwide, we have the technology to make our Earth almost like a force field. We have the ability to redirect asteroids and comets, but we need to work together to do that. It's the single greatest threat to us right now, and it can be stopped. And sites like Göbekli Tepe, it's a hard word to say, excuse me, sites like this left behind to leave a message saying, look, we were once greater and we were wiped out and we had to start all over again and we don't even remember where we came from. And this aching question in humanity because we were smacked so hard that we have amnesia and we don't remember those times when we had great civilizations and we had a maritime culture that is known as Atlantis fantastically. So the story of the Atlanteans is probably a true story. It's probably explaining this advanced maritime culture that diffused these similar ideas of civilization, agriculture all across the world, that were building these henges and hedges, that were building these megaliths. These people were wiped out. Not all of them. Some of them were left behind, and they were probably worshipped as the elite class or the demigods that we see in left over, buried in the mounds. And this is why we have their genetic traces, the Denisovans and the Neanderthal. And I think the Denisovans were probably the species closely related to even an older species that was a bigger, more athletically superior version of us giants. And I think the further you go back, the bigger we were. Because remember, at one time, it was a very warm climate with shallow oceans all over the place. And the Cambriatic seas, the Cambriatic period, during this time, turtles were the size of Volkswagens. Literally, an armadillo was bigger than your car. If those things were around then, and they're around now and they're tinier, what if something like us was around then? Think of us on the scale to an armadillo. An armadillo is about the size of a big house cat. If they were the size of a car during this time period, and there was something similar to us around, we would be the size of a goddamn tree. We would be 30, 40 feet tall. So, I believe this group related to us, we almost devolved based on our climate. I believe in evolution, but I believe evolution happens inside of a bubble. It happens based on your surroundings and your environment. You evolve to adapt. And if shrinking and downsizing and living shorter lifespans was an adaptation that prolonged or advanced the species' existence, then it was going to happen. And that's how evolution occurs. It's through traits, selective traits that get passed on that create adaptation, that create survival, and create the survival of a species. And that's all a species exists for, is to survive. That's its underlying point. The underlying point of life is to live. The other thing I began to talk about were, why are places and things called what they're called? So, a good place to start if you want to find some artifacts, some arrowheads, or some ancient tools, start by getting the oldest map you can find of your area. On the East Coast, probably can find maps from the early 1700s, late 1600s if you're lucky. Find places that have similar names. The street names that are on that old map that are still streets today, that's your starting point, because the first roads were once paths, were once trails. So these same migratory paths and ways that follow waterways often, or follow a way to water often, became the first roads. And you can start from there. You can also use this thought process in mind. If you find an old church near water, near a creek, look in that creek. You're going to find Indian artifacts, because unfortunately what religions and belief systems do is they like to put their belief system, their temple, right on top of the older religion's temple to completely supplant it and erase it. Because if you can control a person's beliefs, you can control the person. So it's a very beneficial thing for society. This idea that an area that was significantly important to the natives or the original inhabitants of that land, and a place that they considered spiritual, a place where they buried their people, well, the church is going to come in and say, oh, that's our special place now, and they're going to put their temple on top of it. And this has been a little tip that has helped me find a lot of really cool artifactual sites. Look for hill cane, hemp. A lot of these sites are clearly quarries that were used for thousands of years. Because there's so many different tools from so many different time periods, because the material's all there. And if you still have hemp growing in patches along with hill cane, you can see now that there's cord and there's shafts, and you've got an arrowhead spear factory. I don't think all the groups are doing this. Maybe some of the groups, they were creating art or pottery stamps. Any stream in this country with a native name, you're going to find artifacts in. And I believe you're going to find artifacts that are way older than 15,000 years, I believe, all over the place. Because that's my thought process in this. I don't think we know how old we are, not even close. We only know what we've discovered. That's the tricky thing with discovery. Just because you haven't discovered something yet doesn't mean that you're not going to. It doesn't mean that, this thing that's 15,000 years old, there can't be anything older than that. We're not going to dig any deeper. Well, what science has proven, archaeological digs in Canada, other digs in Colorado, what we're beginning to find is, for a couple more thousand years after that 15,000 years, we don't find anything. It's dead and barren soil. Then about 4,000 or 5,000 years after that. So the Clovis points were actually about 13,000 years old, because they're 11,700 BC. You add the 2,000 years after AD, you can get about 13,000. So we estimate around 15,000 years ago is when the comet or the impact event happened. There was this 2,000 year gap where there was nothing. But then after that 15,000 layer, started finding all kinds of human activity again. So there was clear human activity, cataclysm, 2,000 years of nothing, and then slowly human presence returned when they discovered this Clovis point. The Clovis point isn't the oldest, it's the rebirth of something that was wiped out, the rebirth of us. And it's why we struggle so hard with that question, where do we come from? And this is why I love these sciences. And I just want to say thank you all. Anyone who's commented or reached out or shared their collection with me, excellent. I love it. I love to collaborate. I think you're going to find, as I surmise, that very similar stuff's going to be found all over the place across this continent, because there was an entire group disseminated for thousands of years after what we thought the oldest group was, the Clovis culture. And your discoveries in your own backyards could change a lot of things. It's fascinating. It's a fun hobby. Please respect the laws. Research the laws of your area. If you have private land, that's awesome, and you're interested in it, you can do whatever you want then. You can dig, do whatever you want. But if you're on private land, or if you're in a trust or a reserve, there's a lot of different little rules. If you're in a stream and it's tidal, you're allowed to take things up to the high water mark, because that land can never be owned. But in natural reservations, you can't add or take living things. You just got to respect the rules. Don't ever dig into burial sites or mounds. It's disrespectful, first of all. It's highly illegal. I'm not a treasure hunter. Even though I have videos about silver mines, I just find it a fascinating connection because of the anthropological story behind it, and then researching the street names and putting them on the old maps of my area and seeing, wow, the story that came back from 1585 back to Germany and France and then came back over later in the late 1600s when Germantown and stuff was formed down in Philadelphia in the Wissahickon Valley, because the French said it was in a place called Acadia, and that was the biggest stream system in that area they now call Arcadia. That's where they looked. The Pennypack is just the next system over. They're connected by connector streams. They're almost in the same exact watershed. The geology is slightly different. It's flowing through the quartz and soapstone vein, the richest one on the East Coast. It's the spot where gold and silver could be geologically. Some of the material like that pick and that hammer I showed in my one video was a material I couldn't identify. I recently found out that it's a very unique mineral. It's a very unique mineral found in the Wissahickon Valley called Wissahickon schist. A lot of the houses, foundations are built with it. It's easy to shape, and it was durable. And it was when they heat treated it, it became extremely durable because it's got layers. It's sedimentary and geomorphic at the same time. It's a very unique stone. It only occurs along that area geology. The Wissahickon is extremely unique in geology. I did a lot of my geology labs there for college. But I just kind of wanted to say thank you all for sharing, and all comments, are welcome. If you don't have anything nice to say, I'm just not going to respond to you. I don't have time for any of that kind of stuff. It's pointless. But I just kind of wanted to say thanks a lot, and if you're interested, please share. Please subscribe. It helps so much. I want to eventually try to get a little funding through my channel of some sort. Anything could help advance the research. Share with your friends. Please tell them to subscribe. If you like it or if you don't like it, I just appreciate your time and any opinion you have, because different ideas, different way people look at things differently. Even a stone tool, we know it's a stone tool. We don't know exactly what they used it for. We can guess. We can make ideas. Some things are obvious because they resemble modern tools, but other things aren't. So we make guesses as to what they were used for, and we just don't know. There are forms of art, and it's just mind-blowing what you can find out there, especially in a meandering stream, because they form deposits, and deposits can have all different time layers and all different crazy things in them. But a lot of people think that this is just a barren land void of people before the Europeans came over. There were millions and millions of Native Americans just on the East Coast before European contact. They were sophisticated, advanced. They had federations. They had warfare. They were constantly attacking one another. So it was really the disease, not the technology of the Europeans. You could fire 7 arrows before you could fire one musket-loaded bullet. The Native American bow was way more lethal than the guns and the cannons. Now, if you had a cannon and had a stockade, it was pretty impenetrable. It was more the sound and the power of it that scared more than it killed. It was the disease, the foreign disease from an unknown people that never made contact, that had no immunity to any of these diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases as well, all kinds of things, but mainly smallpox. It decimated the native population more so than anything else. If the smallpox didn't come along with the Europeans, then the Europeans would have never been able to conquer the natives. They would have pushed back. But at that point, when allegiances and trade lines were formed, because there was no full unification of all Native American tribes, they could be paired and allied to the Dutch one day, allied to the British the next, depending on that individual clan's interests. You could have one Susquehannock clan paired with the British and another paired with the French. Would they fight each other? Probably not. At that point, they'd probably turn and kill them all. But my point being is the Beaver Wars and the time leading up to the French Indian War and times before that were extremely confusing with the allegiances, and no one could really be trusted. It was hard to know what side who was on. I don't want to get into all that really, just mainly wanted to just explain that living is learning. If you don't learn, then you're not living at all. To live is to learn. The point of life is to live. The ultimate point of any species is to continue, to survive. And I believe we need to look at this stuff seriously, because we can avoid what happened before. We cannot get hit by a comet or an asteroid and have to start all over again and forget who we were, because that's exactly what will happen. The same thing will happen again. We were warned, and if we want to ignore it, then, fool me once, fool me twice. You know how that goes. So thanks again, and please subscribe, and I can't wait to hear from anyone who's got an interest or has found fascinating things. These breakthroughs are made by everyday people, and we all have the Library of Alexandria in our pocket. We have endless access to information at the touch of our finger with a smartphone. For all the bad that people say technology can do, the great that it can do is you can self-educate. You can be an autodidact. You can soak up any information you want, and you can add to the knowledge by discovery. And discoveries happen sometimes by accident, but if you start using some of these methods, like looking at the old maps, looking at where hill cane grows and where hemp grows, and looking for the meandering stream deposits near old churches, you'll find all kinds of stuff. These are just some tips and some methods, but there's that much human activity across this whole continent that the remnants are left everywhere. And I mean everywhere, in plain sight often. Go to these places after rainstorms, especially ones that flood and then recede, like flash floods. Flash floods flip the whole new layer on the top, revealing a whole different story, a different time period. So, thank you all, guys. Again, my name's Ron, channel's Happy Lost Souls. Please hit subscribe, ring that bell to get updated notifications. Try to put a couple videos out every month, either music or archaeology. I know they're two very different things, so you don't have to like the music or anything like that, or even really agree with the opinions or theories that I'm putting forward in support of others who have put these theories forward. Graham Hancock has written books, The Magician of the Gods. I encourage anyone to check out the Joe Rogan podcast with Graham Hancock. There's also a renowned geologist on there too that he collaborates with, Randall. I forget his last name. It's eluding me. But super intelligent people who put forth this argument with great vigor and great information to back themselves up. But I've actually included it in the North American Neanderthal playlist there. But again, please spread the word and subscribe if you can. It's a huge help. Stay safe, everyone. Peace and love.